not so many opportunities to talk about the emotions and possible anxiety which this information generates. So, for example, I was part of a multidisciplinary team who then thought about how to support students in environmental sciences. Internationally, we have a network called Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators. Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators. I get a message that there might be something wrong with the screen sharing. So let's see how that goes.
Okay, I think now we're good, at least on our side.
Okay. Do you see any of my screen now?
And we don't. Can you try to share the screen again?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so can you see now the taxonomy of climate emotions? Yes, excellent.
Yes, we see this.
Yeah, thank you. So I was mentioning that there are some initiatives in University of Helsinki. Then we have a national project on social and health sectors about eco-anxiety and eco-emotions. So this is in Finnish. The eco-anxiety project, I've been much involved in that. So those of you who want to use Google Translate or happen to know Finnish can find many resources there. From the academic side, I'll mention this article that you can now see on the screen, Toward a Taxonomy of Climate Emotions, published in January in the Frontiers in Climate journal. So there's an exploration of the very many possible emotional shades and forms that can manifest in relation to climate change. And then these different emotions, including anger, guilt, sadness, empowerment and feeling of togetherness with others when people try to do something for the matters, they can also manifest in several forms. So the so-called valence, which is one term in emotion research to explore these matters, that can be quite different. So when talking about climate anger, for example, we can have a righteous anger about the many injustices related to climate change, or we can have a rage in social media about the whole topic of climate change if you are coming from more climate skeptical or denying position. So simply saying the word of the emotion like anger and putting the word climate in front of it, then of course we need some discussion about what we mean. In this article I'm mostly exploring sort of ethical climate emotions, but just pointing out that there can be many forms of these. But anyway, you can find more information about the wide scope there. We also have a podcast with experienced environmental psychologist Thomas Doherty, who did also research on these matters earlier on. We provocatively titled it Climate Change and Happiness, because we want to sort of raise up the question that what could happiness be in the era of climate change, and recognizing the intersectional justice dynamics in people's context around the world. So definitely the possibilities for a good and meaningful life, which is sort of the core of happiness in my point of view at least. So those dynamics are very different for different people, of course, because the ordinary circumstances of our lives are so different, and some of us have to suffer more injustices than others. But anyway, that podcast is found on the usual podcast platforms, including Spotify and others. So if you want to listen to discussions around climate emotions and what it means to live amidst climate change, so there's resources there. This is my Finnish book, Mieli maassa, ympäristötunteet, a handbook of eco-emotions in Finnish. So just those of you who may have some knowledge of Finnish, I mentioned that. But today, in this short time, I want to spend quite some time discussing what is very new and relevant and fresh for me, which is a process model of eco-anxiety and ecological grief. It's a forthcoming academic publication, which hopefully goes forward quite soon. It's in peer review right now. So There I'm doing a review of relevant literature, and then I'm constructing a new model of the general process of encountering the ecological state of the world, or the socio-ecological state of the world, if we want to name it that way. And the aim is to make a model which is simple enough that it can be easily used, but also nuanced enough that it doesn't give a very narrow interpretation of the complexity of this process. So not any 5 stages model, but instead a model which tries to be more dynamic. This is one figure related to that model. There's also another one which I'll soon show. So this brings out that there is the general process, which is different for different people, of course, and then we can have particular phenomena and processes where also sadness and anxiety and distress are present in various ways. I have named some examples here. On the top, for example, anxiety related to a predicted major heat wave. That's something that happens for some Finns also, and it's even more worrisome for people in Central and South Europe, not to mention Africa and so on. On the right, anxiety and grief arising from changing seasons, the so-called winter anxiety or snow grief could be terms for some of these feelings in Finland, for example, where lots of people would like the winters to be as snowy as they have been, but now global warming is changing that. Then there's also a couple of other examples mentioned. So my point here is that we also need some clarity about whether we are talking about particular processes or whether we are talking about the general process. But of course, these are interlinked. So many persons, for example, who feel some kind of anxiety during a major heat wave made more intense by global warming. So it's about that, but also about climate change in general. So there are interconnections, but also it's good to recognize that there is both the general process and more particular ones. So the new model has some chronological aspects, a stage of unknowing. Contemporarily, it's only for small kids because the knowledge about the ecological crisis is so widespread, usually. A complex phase of semi-consciousness where people partly know and partly try not to know. It's a complex stage of negotiation. Some kind of awakening or realization. If that happens, there may be shock or various kinds of trauma even. And then people go into what I'm calling in this new model, coping and changing in 3 dimensions. And this is the core of what I want to share with you today. So using various kinds of literature, lots of that, I'm condensing what is needed into 3 broad dimensions. So on one hand, this is a simplification, but I'm hoping that it might be useful also. So in order to cope and to change, to transform, there's a need for both action, emotional engagement, which I'm calling here grieving, because at least in the first years of encountering the state of the world, it is a process of sadness and grief, I'm arguing. And then what I here call distancing, which means keeping some distance to the knowledge about ecological crisis. And what I'm arguing here is that first, all these 3 are needed, but then if a person goes overly strongly into just one of these dimensions, then there is a danger of having some problems. For example, if you do really a lot of action that helps the planet and also you, usually in many ways, but if you don't take breaks, if you don't encounter the difficult emotions, there's a great danger for burnout in the long run. And this is something which is seen in empirical research about young climate activists, for example. But there's many good things in life that climate activism brings for many people, if not most people, but then there's also difficulties and there is the danger of burnout. And then for distancing, some forms of that are healthy. That's sometimes difficult to accept for people because the climate cause, for example, is so urgent that one may feel a need to do constantly things about it, but usually people just don't have the energy to do that if they don't rest also. And there's differences in people in this regard also. So we need some kind of healthy distancing, which can be called self-care. But then if we go overly strongly into that dimension, we end up in denial or disavowal, and that brings problems both for the planet and for the person. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance, for example, if you only do distancing. And for grieving, if you only wander in the territory of grief and sadness, then it can easily become too much unless you have some element to balance that grief. And this is something that the scholars in grief and bereavement theory are very much bringing forth, that it's very normal to have some changes, what's sometimes called oscillation, between more explicit engagement with the difficult emotions of grief and then doing things in your everyday life which require attention and which you need to do. So this is the idea that all three dimensions are needed for constructive coping, adjustment, and transformation, but an overly intense focus on only one of these causes problems. And if any one of these is obstructed, adjusting becomes much more difficult. And this is also one example where the intersectional justice issues come into play. So people's communities and societies are widely different in regarding how much these dimensions are possible. For example, there may be so much trouble that it's difficult to get any rest, for example, or there may be not so many possibilities for civil action in some societies, for example. And here the results of some recent studies, like the very large climate anxiety study led by Ogun Bode and colleagues, and the results of that are interesting in this regard. So if people have enough possibilities for participatory action and feeling efficacy, then that helps, but the situations in various countries are very different. So that was in a nutshell what I wanted to share with you from this new model, and I think this is very relevant both for educators and for students also, trying to find some balance between these different dimensions. And then, of course, the practical methods of doing so can be very, very diverse. And use things like participatory drama or creative writing. Okay, so I guess you can hear me now. There was a message that something muted me for, but did you hear what I said about art-based methods, or was that muted? Okay, no. Okay, so let's start from there again. So the methods that one may use to trying to find a balance between these dimensions, the range of those methods is quite diverse. And one very good thing to do is to use art-based methods, because humans as bodily creatures, emotions live in our body minds, so to speak. So more holistic methods help us in many ways. And I was glad to hear that you have discussion of some art-based methods in this event, especially in the afternoon. In Finland, a couple of people have been using drama methods, participatory drama, for example. Creative writing is one example. Reading groups where there is also discussion of the emotional impact. That's something that has been found helpful. And then many of the methods in more traditional emotion-focused work can be applied also for eco-emotions. And there are some important ethical discussions to be had, for example, about the role of guilt and shame. And I think that discussing the difficult relationship between individual responsibility and the need for structural change is one of the key issues here. And I'm siding with those who argue that, of course, individual actions are needed, but then structural change is needed even more. So one of the challenges of so-called ecological emotional skills, which is a concept I'm using here, one ecological emotional skills is that we learn to balance our more individual possible feelings of guilt and shame with knowledge that nobody should take all the burdens on his or her shoulders, because we are living in the midst of structural dynamics which greatly shape our actions. So there's a lot of work to do also in talking about different emotions and how we evaluate them, what kind of estimations we make of ourselves and other people regarding on how we feel, for example. One example of this is that how we see sadness. Do we see displays of sadness as signs of weakness or signs of strength, for example? And often these dynamics have gendered dimensions. Still in Finland, it's quite customary to think that, you know, a true man should not cry publicly. So that's one example of the old gendered emotion norms, which also have an effect on the encountering of ecological emotions. And finally, a lot could be said here, but I try to keep this short and in time. It's very important to notice that people have many kinds of empowering emotions also related to ecological issues, both individually and collectively. And often it's difficult to explore those because communities haven't really encountered the difficult emotions. So to put it very, very simply, in order to access joy more, we first need also encounter of feelings of sadness. So these are very much interlinked, and I want to emphasize that the whole range of emotions is something very valuable in relation to ecological issues. So this was a brief presentation of some aspects related to eco-anxiety and eco-emotions, some glimpses of what we have been doing in Finland. So thanks for the invitation, and I'm looking forward for the Q&A now.
If ever you are speaking, you're muted.
Do you hear me now? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much. We're having we're navigating the tech world. Thank you so much, Panu, for joining us. For giving us this very holistic insight into how to also explore eco emotions, letting us know that there is this whole range to be explored, and to also make us realize again that it's important to focus on these different dimensions. To not get stuck in only doing action or in only grieving, but to really move through these different aspects in a more wholesome way, I guess. I want to ask if there are any questions here in the audience. Yes, we have a question. I'm just going to get the microphone. I've been told that this dice can just be thrown at anyone.
Thank you so much for an interesting discussion or a presentation. I wondered how the data was conducted, whether you made some specific kind of interviews, or I'm just curious.
Yes, and if it's okay, I'll comment on the question in the chat at the same time, which is about the generational and differences. So I come from interdisciplinary research background, so I'm not doing empirical interview research myself, for example. I'm sometimes facilitating discussion groups about eco-emotions, and there's, of course, empirical observations coming from that. But what I do is that I draw from a wide range of studies in different disciplines where there is also many kinds of empirical research. So there's anthropology and ethnography. sociology, and then different kinds of psychological research. Surveys have been increasingly done. In Finland, we also did a national survey about climate change and emotions in 2019. And a recent research article by my colleague Julia Sangervo, Kirsti Jylhä, who is in Sweden most of the time, and me. So that provides an analysis of that survey. And those are important, but of course, we have to realize that different people have different capabilities in recognizing emotions in general and climate emotions in particular. And this goes to the generational differences point. So for example, in our study, the youngest age group in Finland of the study, which was from 15 to 30, quite wide range, unfortunately. So they recognized something like 30% of them guilt in relation to climate change. And the oldest segment of people, that was less than 10%, roughly speaking, from memory. So there's a huge difference in recognition of climate guilt. And based on my observations in Finland in general, I definitely do not believe that only 10% of the old Finns feel some kind of climate guilt. I think there's much more of that, but it's very complicated. It's difficult for people to recognize it, to encounter it, or to report it in these kinds of surveys. So this is a point regarding the generational differences that I think we need careful observation methods if we want to do exploration of the eco-emotions among people of different ages. And we have to notice that many young people are more capable of recognizing these emotions and bringing them forth. And there may be all kinds of social dynamics affecting this. For example, if the people who are close to you talk about eco-emotions, it's much easier for you also to talk about them. But if you are, for example, 60 years old and almost nobody in your environs talks about these, then it's very tricky for you also to start talking about them. So I personally believe that there's much more complexity in eco-emotions among adult and older populations than we know yet, because it's difficult to study. Thanks for the good questions.
Thank you, Panu. I guess this also relates to what you shared previously about the sort of gendered dynamics of emotions and who's able to speak about what or feels as though they're able to express themselves. We have a question from Vanessa. Vanessa, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. You have made a very practical talk here. It was very interesting. Also from the more theoretical perspective, could you maybe say something to how you see emotions? What is emotion to you in general, not only eco-emotion?
Yes, thank you, Vanessa. Nice to meet you here. And in the Finnish language, we actually have one concept, tunne, which roughly correlates with feeling, but we use that for almost all kinds of feelings. Then we have mieliala, which correlates with moods. So just pointing out that even one's background in different languages, I think, shapes the intuitive understanding of emotions and feelings. And when analyzing emotion research from different disciplines, the use of concepts of emotion, feeling, and affect, there's great variation, and it's quite difficult to bring all the research perspectives together in this sense. So to trying to be simple and short here, I think that there clearly are quite automatic emotions or affects, what some people call affect programs. So that's one dimension of it. There is the collective dimension. Some people use affect theory to describe that kind of collective emotionality or affectivity. Then there is more conscious emotions and feelings, but here terminology from different scholars is different. Some people use emotion also to refer to conscious feelings, and some people would like to reserve the word feeling more for that. And then we have the longer term affective phenomenon. And I think this is something which definitely needs more discussion in eco-emotion or feeling research. And it's so complex that, for example, in my taxonomy of climate emotions article, I didn't even try to get into the nuance because that would be like easily three articles more of trying to make some sense of it. But just noticing that it is long time, weather conditions, so to speak, also have an effect on the more particular weather implications using these kinds of metaphor. I think that's very important for eco-emotions or feelings or whatever word we use for that. So hopefully this clarifies something, but it's
Thank you for that. Unfortunately, we don't have much more time for more questions because of the tight schedule. I do notice that there's a question in the chat, so maybe Panu, if you have some time just to stay to answer that question, I think that would be much appreciated.